ghosts anywhere, they would be here.
Prisons and jails built in America in the 17 and 1800s were gruesome reminders that crime did not pay. In a time when deplorable living conditions walked hand in hand with death and personal tragedy, these institutions of punishment were truly terrifying places that assuredly left deep psychic fissures in this world and the next. The Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was just such a place.
Most prisons before Eastern State was constructed were large open holding cells, and they would put everybody in together. They'd put adults in with children, men in with women, and all types of criminals. So petty thieves would be locked in with murderers, all packed into these large open holding cells. They were incredibly violent, disease-ridden. Sometimes disease would wipe out the entire prison population. There was very little sense that people would be better after they were released.
In response to these wretched conditions, a new type of prison was planned. Built on an elevated cherry orchard just outside Philadelphia, the Eastern State Penitentiary was supposed to be a new and humane way to house prisoners. But in fact, it turned out to be a place of solitude and misery.
In the early years, prisoners at Eastern State lived in extreme isolation. They woke up in their cells, spent 23 hours a day in their cell, went to bed in their cell, and knew almost nothing aside from this small white room. Typical sentence was about 2 years. Inmates were given some kind of simple work to do in their cells and given nothing to read except for the Bible. The majority of them were illiterate anyway. And so, in the early decades of the prison's use, the experience of an inmate would be about surviving isolation. Day in, day out, for years at a time with almost no human contact. Spending years in strict isolation can drive a person insane.
Prisoners were housed in small individual cells with no windows and shortened doorways, specifically designed to humiliate an inmate. The only light source in the room came from a single hole cut in the ceiling of the cell, called the Eye of God.
The prison cells at Eastern State were designed like small chapels. They have a high arched ceiling and blank white walls, and the only light comes in from above, and they call it the Eye of God. And so when you're in there, you look up and all you see is this little circle of daylight looking down, and it does look a little bit like an eye. And it's meant to create the impression that you're always being watched, and that even though there's no windows in the room, God is looking down at you through this little point, this little eye above. It's spooky.
The key to the success of Eastern State Penitentiary was the complete isolation of its inmate population. As a matter of practice, prisoners were hooded whenever they were outside their cells. Cells were built with soundproof walls in order to keep the prisoners from fraternizing with each other. For all essential purposes, the inmates were cut off from the outside world, forbidden to see another prisoner for the entire duration of their sentence.
The people who ran Eastern State Penitentiary had a fetish about silence, and so even the guards pacing these corridors wore socks over their shoes to muffle their footsteps. And the carts they used to roll food up and down the hallways had leather over the wheels. They'd roll silently up and down the hallways. Inmates ate in their cells. They slept in their cells. Inmates were only taken out of their cells to bathe about once every 2 weeks. And when they did that, they had their heads covered with a hood with no eye holes. Basically put a bag over their head so that all the inmate would remember from their time at Eastern State was the 4 walls of their cell.
Silence was strictly enforced at the Eastern State Penitentiary. If a prisoner was caught making any noise at all, they were severely punished. Prisoners who continually broke the rules faced stiffer and stiffer penalties. Over time, the prison's administrators had to resort to more intense forms of punishment to get their point across. Punishments for repeat offenders included the straitjacket, the iron gag, and a particularly hideous contraption called the mad chair.
Most prisons at the time were extremely violent, and inmates who came into Eastern State could expect at first they'd be treated very well. But if inmates committed infractions of the rules at Eastern State, they'd be treated the way they'd be treated at any other prison in the early 1800s, which was with extreme force. Sometimes they would take inmates out into their exercise yards, hang them by their wrists from chains, strip them naked, and douse them with water in the wintertime. There was accounts of one inmate having ice hanging from his beard while he hung naked out in the exercise yards. There was even an inmate named Matthias Macumsey who was consistently making noise, and they couldn't get him to stop. And they put him in a device they called the iron gag. It held his hands behind his back, and a bar went up and into his mouth and put a metal rod against his tongue to keep him quiet. And he struggled against it, and his tongue swelled, and he choked to death. There was an investigation. They looked into it and decided that he'd asked for it. He had it coming. This was typical for the way prisons were run at the time. Life was cheap in the early 1800s.
If a prisoner survived solitary confinement and had the physical strength to conquer the prison's many torture devices, he had one more demon to defeat, that being disease. The prison's poorly designed heating, plumbing, and ventilation systems worked together to spread the putrid odor of human waste to every nook and cranny of the building. These unsanitary conditions caused outbreaks of illness that ravaged both the inmate population and the guards assigned to maintain order in the prison. Without a doubt, serving time at the Eastern State Penitentiary was a mind-numbing experience. There were many documented instances where prisoners went insane because they could not handle the isolated conditions that were the mainstay of the prison. The Pennsylvania system of punishment at the Eastern State Penitentiary was finally abandoned as it produced very few reformed prisoners. For over 150 years, the Eastern State Penitentiary housed murderers, gangsters, and the criminally insane. Al Capone, America's most notorious gangster, was sentenced to 1 year at the Eastern State Penitentiary in 1929.
By far the most famous of our alumni is Al Capone. A lot of people don't realize that the first time that Capone was in prison was in Philadelphia. He was traveling from Atlantic City back to his home in Chicago, and Philadelphia police stopped him while he was in town and searched him and found that Capone was carrying a .38 caliber revolver, and it was loaded. The courts in Philadelphia wanted to make an example out of this famous Chicago gangster, and so they gave him the maximum sentence, which was 1 year in prison. Ironically, though, they sent him up here to Eastern State Penitentiary, and while the courts were trying to be harsh with Capone, the Department of Corrections was extremely generous. And so while he lived here, Capone had oriental rugs and oil paintings on the wall of his cell, and he had a cabinet-style radio, which would be fairly high-tech, like having a DVD player now. We've never known why he got such special treatment while he was here. He might have bribed the warden. It might have just been that he was a celebrity.
In 1956, cell block number 15, also known as Death Row, was constructed at the Eastern State Penitentiary, one of the last buildings added to the prison complex.
Cell Block 15, otherwise known as Death Row, was a two-story building that housed the worst examples of humanity.
Cell Block 15 was the last cell block added into the Eastern State Penitentiary complex, and it's where they housed the most violent and disruptive inmates in the Pennsylvania system. It's the only cell block that had modern electronic door locks where they could open and close cells by pushing buttons, which kept the guards distanced from the inmates. They were scared of these guys. Many inmates spent the last weeks, days, hours of their life inside of cell block 15, and on the day of their execution they'd be shipped out to a different institution to die in Pennsylvania's electric.
By the 1960s, the march of time had been particularly unforgiving to the old prison. The Eastern State Penitentiary was considered out of date and in a state of miserable disrepair, and in 1971, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania officially closed the doors of the historic Eastern State Penitentiary. Reopened in 1994 as an historic site, daily public tours are conducted at the Eastern State Penitentiary, and special ghost tours are held at night prior to Halloween. No better place could be found to host a ghost tour. In fact, many visitors come to the prison in the hopes of having a supernatural encounter with one of its many spirits. The prison's fortress-like atmosphere, crumbling cell blocks, and water-stained ceilings most certainly lends itself to the perception that the place could be haunted.
I think there's a couple different reasons that Eastern State is so haunted. First is the stone construction. A lot of old buildings, especially public works buildings, were made out of stone. And a lot of paranormal researchers have proven that certain types of stone seem to magnify or collect psychic or spirit energy, and that would explain why a lot of castles in Europe are reported to be haunted. Just the untimely demise of so many people and so many horrific experiences of the different prisoners that really have embedded themselves into the very foundations of the prison. And it's like a giant tape recorder that replays these horrific experiences over and over and over again, and probably will never end with the amount of torture and torment that's taken place there.
But for those lucky or unlucky few who have experienced something out of this world inside the prison, paranormal ambience definitely does not account for all the things they have encountered there.